wondering how I got into this mix.
Hey everyone, this is Derrick Broze of the Conscious Resistance Network and 90.1 KPFT Houston. And today we're bringing you another important guest as we continue our conversations related to COVID-19, but also in general with disease, with germs, and how we can keep ourselves healthy, because we're noticing there are a lot of people who are thankfully using this crisis, this event that's hitting our world right now, as an opportunity to start rethinking the way they live their lives and to start thinking about the way they treat their bodies. And as we do that, it's important for us to have accurate information. So we're going to be talking today with Don Lester and David Parker. They are the authors of the book, What Really Makes You Ill? How Everything You Thought You Knew About Disease is Wrong. And welcome. How are you guys doing?
We're doing very well, thank you. And
thank you.
It's great for you to invite us onto your show. We're looking forward to having a chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go right into this. The audience, you guys are probably familiar that just last week we talked with Dr. Andrew Kaufman, and we asked the question, is the germ theory still valid? And we discussed some things like germ theory versus terrain theory. We're going to be continuing a little bit of that conversation and expanding on it even further, maybe asking some questions that I have and some questions that some of you have posed. But before we do that, let's get into the specifics of the book and when you guys released the book and what caused you to write the book.
Okay, well, it's been sort of a long process, the book. I mean, as you probably know, or you will when you receive it, it's nearly 800 pages, so it's quite a tome. And we were researching it and writing it over a period of 10 years. So there's a lot of research gone into it, and it covers a big area. It covers everything within the medical establishment, right from the germ theory right up to all the different diseases, both in humans and animals, because we wanted to see whether the same applied to animal diseases, which it does, and we explain that in the book. We wanted to look back into history and look at things like the Black Death and various plagues and pandemics that supposedly happened in the past, and see if we could find explanations for those. Which we did. And in all cases, we found that the fallacy of the germ theory always held up. There was always a much more plausible explanation for whatever the disease was. And we explain those in the book, whether it's human or animal. So there's not a different category for animals and something different for humans. It's the same thing. The same mistakes are made, and they're provable. There's also in our book, we heavily reference it. So there's 40 pages of reference. So people can check our work if they want and see where it's come from, the various papers that we've studied. So that's why it took a long time to put this book together. Reasons for doing it, throughout our lives, particularly mine, I had some of my close family and friends who were diagnosed with cancer, various ones. But all at that time, I didn't know what I know now. And they all took the prescribed treatments and medications, whether it's chemotherapy, radiation, whatever, and they all died, all of them. But I had one relative, an elderly lady who didn't. She was diagnosed, lived in the same area, and was diagnosed with a cancer, but she actually refused to have anything to do with the medical establishment, and she lived. And they were able to tell her after about a year to 2 years that her cancer had completely gone. So it was that sort of thing that I thought, well, there's something very strange going off here. So Dawn and I started to look into it, because we've written another couple of books together. One about the nature of reality, actually, which had nothing to do with health. But there was a section in it where we needed to look into viruses. And really that's what kicked us off, with the stuff that had happened in my personal life and the fact that we needed some information. And it was a tin of worms, it was a real Pandora's box. Once we started looking, the more we looked, the more we found what the medical establishment was saying to us didn't make any sense. I mean, like most people, we'd grown up to believe that the medical establishment knew what they were doing, and what they said was sacrosanct and was all backed up by solid science. So it was a great shock to us as we looked into it to realize that was not true. So we thought, well, the only thing we can do is we'll start, as a professional, I'm an electrical engineer, and Dawn was an accountant. It's not anymore because she doesn't have the time. But we had the right mindset. We had very logical minds, and we were able to ask simple questions. And so that's why we titled the book, What Really Makes You Ill? That's the most basic question we could think. And we kept that in our minds all the time and said, well, what really makes you ill? Whatever disease we were looking at, well, what is really making this person or this animal ill? And we wouldn't stop until we found a reason that was backed by science. So we didn't set out to, have a go at the medical establishment. We didn't set out to make them look fools, because we realised that most doctors, have the best interests at heart for people. But they can only do what they're trained to do, and if what they're trained to do is wrong, then they're going to have results which are wrong. And some doctors, like as you mentioned, Dr. Andy Kaufman, they realised over a period of time that what they've been taught is wrong. And many doctors, and we've talked to quite a few over the years, have also come to that decision that what they've been taught is wrong, and they end up coming out of the profession. So the doctors we've been in touch with are sort of very grateful for what we've done, but many of them, because they lose their jobs, won't speak out publicly. They'll speak to us and have spoken to us privately, but they won't speak out publicly, not yet anyway, because they know what's going to happen. And we can talk about one sort of Dr. Andrew Wakefield, who found some information a few years ago now, which started to connect. His speciality was young children with stomach complaints, and that was his speciality and his team. And he started to try and find out what the reasons were. And in his investigations, he found that certain things, and sometimes it was vaccinations, were inflaming the stomachs of the children so that they then couldn't uptake vitamins in the food they were taking. And so they weren't getting the nutrients, and these were young children we're talking about. Because they weren't able to digest the nutrients because of the inflamed stomach, they were then suffering with what is brain disease, really, damaged brains, which is autism, so they put them on the autistic spectrum. But when he started to publish his findings, the medical establishment just went crazy, and they hounded him out of his job. And I think he's living in America now, but the British medical establishment, as I say, really went to works on the guy, and he lost his job, and they took his license off him just for telling the truth. So I think as much as anything, the establishment wanted to make an example of him. We've looked at his work. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. It's sound. But obviously there's big money behind it, pharmaceutical companies with vaccinations, and they weren't having any of it, so they wanted him out of the way. And so that was a warning to all doctors, of course, and for the most part it's worked. But there's still some brave souls like Andy Kaufman who are deciding now they've got to speak out, they've got to do something about this, because it causes so much suffering and misery around the world, and indeed deaths.
Absolutely.
There's well, some of the information we've worked with is that I think it was a Starfield report in America, which sort of showed that there's a thing called iatrogenesis. I know it's a horrible word, but it basically means sort of death by the medical establishment. And she, at the time, found that there was something like 150,000 people dying every year in the States from, not through medical malpractice, but from taking the drugs they were prescribed in the prescribed way, and the drugs were killing them. And that's a huge amount of people to die every year, and yet there's no scandal. You'd think that would be a huge scandal. And of course, wherever Western medicine is practiced, you've got the same thing in every country. But these things are very difficult to find the answers to, very difficult to dig that information out for obvious reasons. They don't want people to know this. And we also found another interesting bit of information where there was 2 reports, official reports that came out in America, and I think there was one in Israel, where when doctors, the medical people went on strike, the mortality rates dropped.
So I appreciate you guys sharing all the information about your book and the background and your original drive to do this research. I wanted to dig in a little deeper. first, though, to kind of establish the thesis of the book just very clearly and plainly for those who might not have heard the previous interview with Dr. Andrew Kaufman, what is the basics of what you're presenting in that? Obviously, you've shared a little bit of your opinions on, finding that the medical industry in many ways, and I think my audience is familiar with this, is not giving us the full truth. But what did you find out specifically? And, what is the answer to that question? What's really making you ill?
Okay, well, because that was the basic question that we asked, what we looked for was to find proof about what the medical establishment was saying. We looked for the proof. We set out to follow the evidence in a truly scientific way. And so when we looked at each disease, if it was viral, then we looked for, okay, let's see where the original technical white papers are that for any sort of virus, there are three basic things that the scientific community, medical establishment, if you like, should do. They should be able to isolate the virus particle. They should be able to produce an electron micrograph of the virus particle. They should be able to fully categorize the virus then and put down all its genetic material, identify all its genetic material. And there should be a white paper then that proves conclusively that that isolated virus is the actual and only cause of the particular disease that they're attributing to it. That should happen for every virus and for every disease. And when we found that evidence wasn't there, so that was a real shock. And we've got exactly the same thing with this so-called pandemic that's happening at the moment. If anyone looks, and we challenge them to do it, you look for the answers to those three questions. And we put these questions in our book so that people can look for themselves, and they never find them. People like Carrie Mullis did the same thing for HIV, and he was the inventor. I mean, he died last year, I think, but he was the inventor of the PCR, which they're using as the test for all of these viruses, and which he said at the time, it was never designed to do that. So they're using the wrong test anyway. But
so let me ask you a question. Just one. Sorry to interrupt. So I'm actually working on a report on Carrie Mullis and HIV and that whole thing, the PCR test itself. So what you're saying, though, and what you guys are proposing in the book, which is what we've heard elsewhere recently, that viruses, in this case COVID-19, have specifically never been isolated, right? So we can go back to any number of viruses or disease that are being named. So I had somebody propose the question to me, two different people. I'll start with the first was just a listener who said, well, what about yeast infection? How do you explain a yeast infection? That was their first question. Is that they're, I guess, basically asking, is that not a real illness of some kind? Now, I know we can discuss on whether or not what they're actually experiencing is the invasion of a virus into the system or the body responding in some different way. But I'd just like to, I guess, put that question to you. When somebody's hearing this, and of course, for most people who grow up in the state-funded education system, this is an idea that's going to be very foreign to them. So how would you explain something as basic as that, as like a yeast infection?
The first point is the idea that there's something called an infection, which means that there's some kind of external agent that invades the body and infects it. And there is no evidence for that whatsoever. So what we found was that whatever the symptoms are that are called an infection have purposes, have a distinct purpose, and they're part of the body's own mechanism for healing itself. Because it's a complete inversion of everything we're told, that it's a warfare model where everything is attacking the body, and so you have to fight it off and defend it, and you have to use poisons so that you destroy these invading organisms. So yeasts are not quite the same as fungi, but they're all part of the body's natural microbiome or mycobiome, and it's all part of the normal processes within the body. So the idea that it's an infection is a mistaken idea, and this is something that people really need to start looking very differently at what diseases and illnesses and symptoms are, because practically all symptoms, and that includes the kind of symptoms that people attribute to a cold, sneezing, coughing, fever, those sorts of things. They're part of the body's own mechanism to mainly expel toxins and repair damage and restore health, quite simply. So something like an infection quite often involves inflammation. So inflammation has a purpose. It's something that, again, the body drives more blood towards a damaged area of the body, and within that blood are various nutrients and repair materials. And so that's what any kind of redness, soreness, inflammation will be. It's all part of that process of the body getting the materials so that the whatever it is, something like an infection is probably more likely to be an irritation, an irritant. Also, candida is that's a fungal infection, isn't it, or regarded as a fungal infection. So it's often regarded as being the result of increased use of antibiotics. Now, antibiotics are toxic by nature. They're supposed to be, because they're supposed to be to kill bacteria. So they are damaging cells, damaging parts of the body. And as those toxins are sort of going within the body, then what's called an infection, a fungal infection, it's because, again, the fungi are part of the body's cleanup process to break down all the sort of dead and damaged cells and all kinds of things to just clean up the area and remove those damaged cells, materials, and just get them away and clear them through the body. So it's a completely different way of looking at these ideas called infection. And in fact, infection it's a misnomer. It's a like virus. It's the origin of the word virus, as you probably know, it's from the Latin for poison. So that's actually what is one of the main causes of illness and diseases and problems within the body. And that's a particularly large chapter in the book, where we talk about all the different ways that people can be poisoned, whether it's through the air, the water, the soil, the food, clothes, dentists, just everything. It's a huge chapter, and it's quite daunting, but it shows where all the poisons come in, how they affect the body, and then so the body's responding in all sorts of different ways. And so an infection, like if it's an inflammation, will certainly be part of that process. So,
and sometimes these, as Dawn has said, when people think, there's inflammation, and this includes doctors, so that they've got to do something about it. But as Dawn has quite rightly said, it's the body's job to, quite often, let's say you damaged your knee, for instance, quite often around joints, you get inflammation, you get swelling. And so the body's trying to immobilize the joint. It's putting this extra blood supply there to heal it. But people tend to think that's the wrong thing. Doctors tend to think that's the wrong thing. So they try to get rid of the inflammation. And they're actually then fighting the body that's trying to do one thing, and they're doing something else to stop it doing it. And this happens a lot because they don't understand. And that's why on the back of the book, in fact, I'll read it out. We put a Voltaire quote, which is worth just listening to. Voltaire, who was a sort of 17th century philosopher, but he said, doctors are men who prescribe medicines of which they know little to cure diseases of which they know less in human beings of whom they know nothing. And that really sums it up. And Voltaire was a very clever man. And so a lot of these things that get called infections, they're not infections at all. The body is trying to do something, and it's invariably toxins that it's trying to get out of the body. And the same thing happens with antibiotics. As Dawn has said, antibiotics means anti-life. That's the word, So it's a toxic material, gets put into the body to kill things, to kill, in this case, bacteria. It's obviously not supposed to kill viruses, but it's supposed to kill bacteria. But the body rightly sees it as a toxin. And so it fires up the endocrine system. All systems go to sort of flush this stuff out of the body as quickly as it can. Well, it often flushes out the toxin that was causing the illness in the first place. But rather than the doctors realizing this, they just think, the antibiotic's been successful. But of course, what tends to happen is you get the overuse of antibiotics every time someone's got an illness of some type, if the doctor thinks, let's give them antibiotics, or sometimes the patients demand antibiotics against the doctor's better judgment. And so you get this overuse of antibiotics. And what is happening is every time you put in this toxin into the body, the endocrine system has to work overtime to flush it out. Well, the more times you do it, it's like over-revving a car engine. If you keep running it at high revs all the time, you're going to damage it. And this is what happens. The endocrine system sort of burns out, and then you get all sorts of other endocrine disorders, which cause lots of other illnesses. And you even get doctors, the medical establishment saying, the reason antibiotics are no longer working is, you've got superbugs that have developed a resistance to the antibiotics. But it's not that. It's the fact that they've damaged the endocrine system that can no longer work properly. So it's always this, as Dawn said, the medical system sees it as a battle, that the body is attacked by different things.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate that you guys mentioned that, the whole warfare mentality, because I think especially Americans will understand that much of what the government and the establishment and different types uses, the language they use is very much a war mentality, the war on terror, the war on drug, the war on this, all these different things. It's really prevalent in our lives. So it's not surprising to, kind of hear you guys point that out. And I do think that's an important piece for people to see. I want to share one other thing with you guys, one other criticism that somebody has sent to me, and get your opinion on it before we move on to discussion on non-communicable diseases. And this is something that I'll just share this with you guys because I think that you might know this person. I tried to reach out to an interview with Dr. Peter. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble finding his name. He works for or worked with the Cochrane collaboration, and you guys may be familiar with that. For the audience who isn't, it's in the mainstream world seen as a very respected outlet for information on medical world and health and things of that sort. And his name is Dr. Peter. I can't even remember his last name. I apologize. I'll pull it up in just a moment. But I reached out to him for an interview because he recently wrote a paper about COVID-19, and he was in fact very critical of the treatment, of the testing, of pretty much all the aspects of the whole response to the virus. And he's someone coming from the more mainstream world, right? He left the Cochrane collaboration after criticizing it itself because he said it had become too beholden to the industry. So I figured, okay, this guy seems to know what's up. I'm going to reach out to him and ask him for an interview and to share his opinion. And he said he checked out my website and he checked out the interview with Andrew Kaufman. And his response was, I am shocked. This guy starts out by saying we have not found any viruses that cause cancer. We have known this for over 50 years since the Epstein-Barr virus caused lymphoma. And what about HIV, HPV, etc.? And he disputes that streptococcus causes throat infection. That they nearly killed me, but within 1 to 2 hours, I got on penicillin. What a total and dangerous idiot he is. I could not take any more. Take this interview down immediately, please. And, we communicated a few emails after that. And basically I said, well, look, I'm looking for somebody to provide the other side of the argument. If you'd like to come on and basically try to answer the questions that you guys are asking. Because I asked Andy this, I said, if I have somebody from the other side, what would you like them to ask? And it's essentially what you guys were saying, like, just show us a paper where a virus has been isolated, right? So unfortunately he chose not to do the interview. But your thoughts on that sort of response?
Well, unfortunately, and Andy was warned about this when he sort of made himself sort of public, and this is the sort of thing, you'll get someone like that, probably working for the industry. They may be prompted by people with vested interests, shall we say, and they'll make statements like that and ridicule people. But as soon as they start calling people names like what an idiot, as you said, you know that they have no genuine evidence. And we always do, and I'm sure Andy does the same, is just say, well, look, if you disagree with us, just show us the evidence. We've asked 3 simple questions, and no one in the world, medical establishment, should not be declaring a pandemic on a virus that they haven't isolated in the way that I've said, that they've not identified it, categorized it. You can't call, and the common sense would say, you don't call a world pandemic when you've not done the basic science on the virus. So, and I would say the same to that guy. Well, fine, if you disagree with us, choose your virus and show us that information. Answer those three questions. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Stefan Lanker in Germany with a case where he did exactly that. He took them to task. I think he offered a huge sum of money in Germany for anyone that could prove that a virus caused measles, which has always been the case. Everyone's believed it, get vaccination. And it went into court, into the Supreme Court in Germany. And the medical establishment could not prove that a virus caused measles. Now, this was only about 3 years ago. Now, you'd have thought that in itself would have made world headlines. But no, they keep that very quiet. But it's on the record, and you can look it up, So that's the sort of thing that happens. So that was just one virus. And Dr. Stefan Lanker, who was a virologist, is on the record as saying that he and his team have never found any viruses to be the cause of any diseases. He's gone public on it. And he proved that one case when he took them to court. So I would say the same to that guy. Well, if you disagree with what we say, produce the evidence. And that's as simple as that.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I don't want to get bogged down in that. I do, as a journalist, try to present, all the different sides of this argument, especially as, most of us have grown up hearing viruses are the cause for illnesses. But I want to give people an opportunity to hear, the different sides of the argument. And unfortunately, so far, nobody from the more mainstream perspective has been willing to take up the discussion. And I hope that will change, but it doesn't look good on their side, I guess, when people are, as you said, resorting to name calling as opposed to discussing the evidence. But let's move on to non-communicable diseases, because this is something that I know I'm really interested in hearing about, and it's something we haven't covered yet. So let's go ahead and you guys just break it down for me. Let's define that first, non-communicable diseases, and then what is the source of them?
Okay, well, just a sort of a brief introduction to it. This is the name the medical establishment call it, non-communicable diseases or non-infectious diseases. So this is any sort of disease situation that they're not blaming bacteria for or a virus. So what they do instead is, for the most part, they blame the body. So you've probably heard the term autoimmune disease. And that's what they're actually saying, is that the body is attacking itself. So you've got things like multiple sclerosis and things like that, where they're blaming the body. And again, so obviously we looked at this in the book and we talk about it in detail. But again, there is no evidence. There is no evidence for the body attacking itself. It's a ridiculous thing to say. But again, we looked for the evidence quite impartially. But what we found is lots of much more plausible reasons as to why the body gets ill in these instances. And this is whether it's cardiovascular, cancer, respiratory diseases, diabetes, multiple sclerosis. There's a whole raft of diseases which the medical establishment blame on anything but the actual causes. And what we found with all of these things, there's, again, two main factors that cause all of these diseases, which can be provable, and that is toxic. In the majority of cases, it's toxic intake, so it's poisoning of one sort or another, which has gone into the body. And we can talk about some of the routes that these things get into the body. And the other main factor, and I know you've done some research on this yourself, is electromagnetic radiation, electromagnetic frequencies. And we've done quite a bit of, as an electrical engineer, obviously, I've done quite a bit of work on this myself. And so between those two things, toxic intake of various toxic chemicals of one sort or another, or electromagnetic radiation, between those two things, all of the other diseases that are not attributable to either bacteria or not attributed to by the medical establishment, which is bacteria or viruses, all of the other diseases, their causes are, as I say, toxic intake or electromagnetic radiation. And we can go through them in a little more detail if you wish.
Yes, please.
Okay. And again, because of your interest, and we share your interest in freedom cells and for people to be truly free. And this is another reason why we wrote the book and why we think it's so important is because one of the things that people need to be free from is this fear of being attacked by one germ or another. And we're looking through the results of that stranglehold that the establishment, and I class them all in this, the establishment, which is backed up by the medical establishment, that they've set in motion a so-called pandemic based on no science, but the governments of the world have either been scared into doing what the medical establishment says, or they're just complicit in it for other reasons, which again is something we go into in the book, in vested interests. But it's nothing to do with actually being a germ, because that's unprovable and we challenge them to do it. It's to do with certain control mechanisms that they're putting in place. And we've seen what they've done worldwide, with imprisoning people in their homes, social distancing, closing all the bars and cafes and shops. I mean, it's crazy. They've never been able to do this before. And they've done it all on the back of scaring people into thinking there's some deadly disease going around. And they have no proof. Even the mortality figures, when you look at them, there's no actual drastic rise in mortality figures around the world in any country you like to choose. I mean, some governments are trying to manipulate them a bit, but not very successfully. But if you look, the evidence is there. So what is happening? Obviously, it's not backed up by there's tens of thousands of people around the world dying, I mean, it's certainly, even if you were to believe it was a disease, and we don't believe that, any deaths that are happening are no more than if you've got a so-called flu epidemic. So the figures don't stack up anyway. But coming back to my original point, if they can't prove that there's a virus to blame or anything to blame, then it's a non-starter. But they've gone ahead and shut the world down, basically, on no scientific reason at all.
I want to add...
Sorry.
Go ahead, Don.
No, all I was going to say was it's not just fear of germs, whether they're bacteria, viruses, whatever. It's fear of all sorts of other diseases because, as David said, lots of others that are blamed on all kinds of causes, and really they're not due to the causes that we're told. I mean, a lot of them are said to be, genetic or hereditary, and there's very little, if any, evidence that anything's passed on genetically. So, which was quite a revelation again, because, you're told, you could get that disease because there's something hereditary, it's in your family. So it's, you've got a, increased risk because of your genetics. So there's, heart disease, cancer, those sorts of things are called potentially hereditary, or, they've got these other causes. So what we've done, what we've been able to do by looking at what really makes you ill, what really causes even these non-communicable diseases, are nothing to do with the kind of causes, factors that they say, which also helps people. The idea is to give people enough information so that they can make truly informed decisions about their health, and then they can be free from the fear not only of germs but from all these other diseases. Asthma, eczema, again, diabetes, heart disease, all these things. You're told to be fearful of them, or you're at risk for this, that, and the other. And yet the causes of all diseases we found were down to 4 factors, which are the 2 David said, the chemical exposures and electromagnetic radiation exposures, but also down to nutrition. So again, diet-based, and also extreme stress. So they're really playing on that one, of course, by hyping up the fear just all the time, getting people scared. And that does have a physical effect on people when they're really under such stress, and obviously the economic situation, and that's really making people fearful. So it's all tied in to what's going on, but it's important for people to learn how much control and responsibility they can have for their own health, and they can then detach from the system in all its aspects and not even be concerned, that's about germs. Okay, I can accept the germ thing, but what about all these other diseases? And you say, well, you don't have to be fearful of those either. I mean, you've got to know what to do, and obviously you've got to know where the exposures are that cause the health problems. So you've got to avoid them.
Yeah, if I could just come in there, because just to help with, because we're saying the non-communicable diseases we found are the two main factors are EMFs and toxic intake. And I think it might just be good to sort of remind people the different sources, just briefly, that toxic chemicals can get into their body, and some might surprise them. They're probably not surprised by the water supply, particularly, and this is particularly bad in the UK. I mean, we get fluoride, chlorine, and ammonia added to the main water supply. So we have to take precautions and have reverse osmosis filter system in our house, because who wants to drink those? And plus, there's all sorts of pharmaceutical byproducts get into the water supply as well. And this is in the UK. We're supposed to be a main country in the world. We're not some third world country. So the air we breathe, there's all sorts of industrial emissions and, of course, geoengineering. So there's all sorts of stuff gets into the air. Also into the soil with the agricultural practices, with pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers that get sprayed. And of course, even if you've got a farm which may be a mile or two away from your house, with their spraying, you get wind drift. So you can still get some of these harmful chemicals coming across your garden or into your house, which you're going to breathe in. Cosmetics and personal care products, there's all sorts of parabens and things in those. These are all endocrine disruptors. You only need very tiny amounts of these chemicals to disrupt the endocrine system, which is a set of ductless glands which control the whole body system. And just tiny amounts of some of these chemicals totally disrupt the endocrine system and then cause all sorts of other problems.
Which includes the adrenal glands, which are the glands that, as David said before, antibiotics, penicillin, supercharged. So anything that's disrupting these, the hormone system, which is what the endocrine system controls, can have devastating effects around the body, because it controls, they control growth, development, all kinds of things. So they're particularly bad for young children, and that's how that, affects their growth and development. And so that's possibly one of the reasons why there's such a phenomenal increase in the kind of conditions that are called autism or autism spectrum disorder or ADD, ADHD, those kinds of things, because their systems are being disrupted while they're growing.
Yes,
so,
I mean,
absolutely.
We all probably can remember thalidomide some years ago. So I'm talking about birth defects now, which thalidomide was a drug that was administered to pregnant women, supposedly to help with morning sickness. So a fairly small thing, really. But it caused horrendous birth defects, with children being born with no arms, no legs, or just hands coming out of their shoulder. It's horrendous. And some of those big, it's the endocrine system. And they found that the certain times of the development of the fetus were more critical than others. But that's just one drug. And there was others like DS. So the drugs that get administered to people have horrendous effects, but there's not enough publicity about them, which also shows the sort of complicity of the worldwide news agencies, shall we say, in suppressing the information. So again, another reason why we wanted to write this book, because you couldn't rely on the authorities, you couldn't rely on the mainstream media, which is supposed to be their job to put this information out, but they never do, because they're all bought and paid for.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I want to recap on what you guys just said for a moment. We were talking about a number of things here, but mainly the gist, just for everybody listening, we're talking about environmental toxins. We're talking about exposure to radio frequency radiation, electromagnetic radiation. We're talking about toxins in the water, of course, in the soil, in the air, in the products that people use, and all these different exposures. And we recently talked with Dr. Stephanie Seneff, and she was focusing on glyphosate exposure and the role that could be playing in making people sick, and particularly in COVID-19, but in general, of course, and the U.S. is where I'm based in, is one of the most heavily sprayed parts of the world. And, these exposures are real. So I'm very thankful you guys are bringing this into the conversation, because although it does seem to be in some circles more and more common sense that what we put in our body is going to affect the way our body feels and responds, it's not so common sense as far as what we're taught in school, and this is something that often I'll have conversations with friends, and we just sort of remark on how crazy it is that we were never taught these basic things about, okay, hey, just think about what you're putting in your body and what you're ingesting and, what you're being exposed to and all the different things you're spraying around you or spraying on your skin and what you're drinking and how those things are going to play a role in how you feel. And instead, yes, the model is very much, you were exposed to this contagious person or this infectious, agent here, as opposed to, well, what did you eat? What did you drink? What are you surrounding yourself with? And to the point of stress, one of you talking about the endocrine system and the adrenal glands, another big part of this is the attack on the pineal gland, which comes from fluoride, which comes from exposure to the blue light from all of our devices and affects our ability to produce melatonin, to get proper sleep. And of course, that affects the immune system. I mean, so this is all a very interconnected attack on the body itself. And so I think it's very important that you guys are drawing those conclusions.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that we found that probably would surprise most people, where toxins again can enter the body, and that's through the clothes they buy. With synthetic fibers and the dyes and plasticizers. I can see you've got a logo on your T-shirt, but some of the things that are in those designs ingress into your skin, and they can be quite toxic. Or even if you have your clothes dry cleaned, with the chemicals that they dry clean them with. I can remember, I'm old enough to remember people like Liberace, the pianist, American pianist, who was very famous and was very famous for wearing very sparkly, a bit like Elton John, who's copied him later on, sparkly suits. But he got to a stage where he was dying, in hospital dying, and his kidneys were failing. And they managed to save his life. But when they found out what it was, is he used to sweat so much when he was playing the piano on stage, and then his suits would go away to be dry cleaned. And it was the chemicals in the clothes that when he wore them again and sweating, they ingressed into his body, and they were so toxic, they were shutting down his kidneys and almost killed him. And that was just from the clothes being dry cleaned. So it gets very difficult to look at all these different sources of where these toxins are coming from. Even dentistry, amalgam fillings contain copper, tin, zinc, mercury even, and also nickel. So all toxic metals, and yet the dentists are putting them in your mouth. You'd have thought that was the last place you'd want to have these things. There's one of the research documents that we read from some American dentists who wrote a book, which I can't remember the title, but we cite it in our book. And he stated a case of a young girl who came to him, and she'd got to have some dental work done, but she'd got leukemia. And cutting a long story short, he wanted to do an experiment, and he got permission to actually take all the fillings out, which he did. And within a few days, her leukemia had disappeared. And people wouldn't believe that it could be anything to do with her amalgam fillings. So we said, well, I'll put them back then, which he did. And sure enough, her leukemia came back again. So he proved his point. Needless to say, he was then allowed to take them out and keep them out. But that was leukemia in a young girl. I think she was 11 years old. So there was something very drastic going on with the poisoning from her fillings that was obviously affecting her blood. So you've got toxic dentistry as well. So you have to, another thing. And then, of course, vaccinations, which we all know about, the toxic materials in vaccinations, and medicines generally, whether it's prescribed by a doctor or even over-the-counter medicines. So these are just some of the areas where we can be taking in toxic chemicals in small doses, but they're cumulative and over a period of time cause serious damage.
I appreciate that you guys talk about putting your... Excuse me. I appreciate that you guys talk about putting the health into our hands, though. I think that's a really important part of this conversation because, like you said, it's in a lot of ways, it's the personal choices that we're making and the things that we're choosing to expose ourselves to. For some people, it can be more difficult, but yeah, we do use vegetable inks in these shirts, so we try a little bit. But we're definitely exposed to so many toxins, and like you said, people use cleaning products. They use the dryer sheets. It's in our environment in so many ways. But I think the beautiful thing about this point of view and this perspective that you guys are bringing in the book, and again, the book is called What Really Makes You Ill, Why Everything You Thought You Knew About Disease is Wrong, is that it's an empowering position. It's not simply saying that, you're going to get sick, you're going to be exposed to something, you have no power. It's telling people very much so the opposite, that whether, they become ill or they end up, spending a lifetime of chronic disease or chronic illness, whatever we want to call it, that in many ways, it's up to us to decide, if that's going to be our path or not. We can decide what food we put in our bodies, what toxins, how much exposure we get to EMR, electromagnetic radiation, decide what type of products we use and all those things that are going to play a major role in keeping us healthy and keeping us not only physically healthy, but mentally healthy. I had one other question that I wanted to touch on. And Don, it came from something that you said that just got me thinking. And I don't know if this is an area of research that you guys have dove into prior to this, but, you mentioned people talking about illnesses being hereditary and that sort of mentality being pushed onto people. And another area that I think connects to this is the topic of epigenetics, and how much of our trauma and the experiences that happen to us, how that can be imprinted onto our DNA or genetic code. And that the idea that rather than it being something hereditary, though, well, this is in your family, but it's actually potentially illnesses and emotional traumas and things of that sort are passed down through the DNA, but not in the sense of hereditary like the medical industry is telling us, but almost in the sense that, people are carrying various traumas with them. I don't know if that's out of your field of scope or if you guys have any thoughts on that.
It's not out of the realm. We haven't delved deeply into epigenetics, but we do know about Dr. Bruce Lipton, who has talked about it, particularly his book. Well, when was it? Yes, that was a while ago. Biology of Belief. No, I was trying to think how long ago he put that out. So it shows that your sort of thoughts, ideas, beliefs can affect how you feel, can affect your health. So the physical body. So it kind of ties in with the sort of stress idea. So if you're very fearful and you're always scared about going to be ill, and the chances are that you're going to stress out your body, and that will you could be ill because of that. Now that ties in with a placebo effect, which is certainly well recognised even within the medical establishment, because they try and do what they call placebo washouts whenever they're trying testing drugs, because they want anybody who's going to respond, have a placebo response. They don't want them to be sort of part of it. It's because people, I was going to say people do have physical responses, even though they've just taken a sugar pill, which is really what a placebo is supposed to be. So it definitely ties in with the sort of idea of epigenetics. I'm not sure about so much at the core, at your core, that you believe something is going to happen. So if you've got what may appear to be a family history of cancer, for example, you can spend your whole life being told, oh, well, there's a family history, so it'll be your turn. And you can just buy into it so much that can happen. I mean, it sounds bizarre, but it can happen.
But if I can just add to that, but there is a physical reason for it as well, which is traceable, because stress, prolonged stress, is one of the factors that releases what's called free radicals in body, mops them up and flushes them out. So it's a natural process. But if those free radicals, which are quite destructive, they will attack cells. if they're left to their own devices, but the body deals with them in a natural process. But if you get an excess of those free radicals and your body's not healthy enough because of lack of nutrition and other things to be able to mop those things up and flush them out, then you get long-term, over a longer period, damage to cells, which can eventually become cancers, because that's what cancer is. So there is this danger when people are under stress for long periods of time that they're actually making themselves ill through excessive release of free radicals. Okay,
which could actually be one of the reasons that some people may be experiencing greater illness around this time, because everyone's being made to be so fearful. So
Absolutely.
They are putting their bodies under stress, and they will be subject to the excess generation of free radicals, which does damage if they're not eating a good nutritious diet with lots of antioxidants. So
don't mention the biologist Bruce Lipton and his book, The Biology of Belief. Now, one of the things that he said in there, which is particularly interesting, because people put actually too much store on DNA, and what he said, the real prime mover are the cells themselves, which can adapt to their environment. So they sort of look at the sort of DNA as a bit like a library, and the cells, depending on their environment and what they need, can pull the information out. So what I'm really saying in simple terms is nothing's fixed. It's nothing's fixed. So if you have a healthy body and keep your environment healthy, you're not locked into something that's happened to your ancestors. It doesn't work that way. So again, it's more fear tactics. It's more misunderstanding by, the parents were fat, so therefore they're going to be fat. That's all nonsense. And we've seen some horrendous examples of this, where in a family, some of the women may have experienced breast cancer and had to have a breast removed, and sort of offspring thought, well, if this is in the family, and they've had mastectomies on healthy breasts, because they were fearful that they may get breast cancer. So horrendous things brought about just by fear. And again, no scientific reasoning for this.
And like you guys said, it's all driven by the fear and this sort of warfare mentality. I really appreciate this conversation. Again, I mean, what we've just covered, it's really showing that our health is really a combination of our nutrition, of what we're exposed to in the environment, what we choose to expose ourselves to, and then yes, to some degree, our belief in the sense of, yes, if you're stressed out all the time, if you're in a state of fear and imbalance, your body's going to produce free radicals, produce cortisol, and going to attack, attack, right? But it's going to produce the symptoms that can allow you to get sick. And I really do think that this is a message that is an empowering one, and that if more people understand that, instead of just, well, it's in my genetics, it's hereditary, or it's just the way it is, or something happened to me, I'm just totally helpless, I can't do anything about it. It's an empowering way to look at our health, and I appreciate that. This has been a conversation with Don and David. They are the authors of What Really Makes You Ill, Why Everything You Thought You Knew About Disease Is Wrong. Anything else you guys want to add before we wrap up?
Well, just to let people know where they can buy it. If they want the book either as a paperback, or you can buy it as an ebook, which is cheaper, and you can get it much quicker, because some places in the world are more difficult to get the deliveries. So some places like to go for the ebook. So we've also got a website where people can get some more information. They can contact us at whatreallymakesyouill.com. And, we're putting up articles on there that can explain some things.
We'll include all the links to your websites and to the books. Of course, everybody, if you want to check out the book, as they said, you can get an ebook version of it, or if you want to try and see if you can get physically delivered with everything going on in the world right now, go ahead and support their work. And obviously, we only covered a very small portion of what's in this book. You said it's 800 pages or so there's a lot more to cover that people can dive into. I recommend checking out their work and their website. And please follow, like, and subscribe, and share all their content, because this is a conversation that we're going to continue to have. We're going to continue to explore these ideas. And as I've said a couple of times, it's an empowering conversation, because we can recognize that our health is really in our hands. So thank you guys for listening. This is Derrick Broze, The Conscious Resistance. Until next time, remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free. Thank you.